we put together a piece some years ago called Redefining Resilience, and it was about this question of resilience started to become very, very widely used, and people use it to mean all kinds of different things. You know, there's a public health framework around resilience. You know, it's the idea that it's about getting back to normal, you know, like how you bounce back in the face of something bad happening to you. There's a lot of talk about personal resilience, especially in the social movement, about how we can take care of ourselves and self-care. So there's all these different ways, and there's lots of different orientations around it. So in the way that we do as Movement Generation, we sort of looked to OAEC, and then we also looked with and through OAEC at how living systems are organized around resilience, and how resilience looks in systems thinking, and then started to apply that to social movement and movement organization. So I wanted just to share that framework a little bit as just almost like a conversation starter, if that's helpful. So I think most people, the most common way that people think about resilience is this idea of just bouncing back. Like, if you're resilient, you bounce back. And I think that the first and most important thing for us is that's actually not the place to start. The place to start is to start with what is the identity of the system we're talking about in the first place. Because how we understand the identity, how we make meaning of a system, really matters in what we're actually trying to preserve. So, you know, resilience in the sense of how do you maintain your core identity, your core functioning, your core purpose in the face of disturbance, or in the face of how change doesn't become disruptive to the core functioning. But that requires actually beginning with being clear about what your identity is. So that has been a huge part of our conversation actually over this last few days. And yesterday it really came up for us. How are we going to define the core identity? Is it going to be about the very specific thing we do? Or is it going to be about a set of values? And this is a tricky question, because if we make our identity so narrow and rigid that it can't accommodate a lot of change, we won't be very resilient. We'll be constantly up against fighting change, right? And that the living world of change is constant, right? And we're fond of saying empires crumble, economies collapse, but ecosystems only ever change. And as that happens, these other things happen, right? So it's like, you want to think like a living system. You don't want to have such a rigid identity like an economy or an empire that's like always in this defensive posture. So so how do you make, so the central principle here, the first point for us around resilience is, what is the identity we are trying to preserve? And how do we make meaning of ourselves, our communities, the living systems upon which we depend, in a way that that itself is aligned with the next sets of dimensions of resilience that I want to talk about. So once you, and this really matters, like for us, like just taking a quick urban context, if you define if you're the city of Oakland, how you understand the identity of the place, of a place like North Oakland. North Oakland, for the city of Oakland, is defined, that's where I live, is defined by maybe a geographic boundary, or it's defined by a tax base, or it's defined by, you know, some other things. If you live in Oakland, you might have a very different identity of what North Oakland is. If you've been living in Oakland for 5 generations, you might define North Oakland as a historically black community. Those are 2 very different identities, and it depends what you're trying to preserve. Like, it really matters if you think of it as just a geographic area, and your interest as the city is maximizing, revenues, then that other part of the identity is actually doesn't come into your calculus around resilience. Whereas if you're in the community and you think of it as a historically black community, then the question is, how do we preserve that identity? So it really matters how we define the identity of the system. And then we think about these other kind of factors that working together create resilience, and so one of them is this idea of latitude or accommodation or like I know some like biologists talk about elasticity, like the idea of the ability of a system to stretch and move and accommodate, absorb change in a way that that integrates it without it being disruptive of its identity. This comes up a lot for us. We've been having lots of conversations yesterday about like if I say what's the opposite of a native species, what do most people say? What's the opposite of a native species? An invasive species. Kendall will say a non-native species. A lot of people will say an invasive species. Like the opposite of a native species is an invasive species, right? And which is not actually true. Not everything that is non-native is invasive. And in fact, the idea that invasiveness is a quality of a species, as opposed to a relationship to the system, is the mistake we constantly make. Right? We're not seeing it as actually, does the system have the latitude to accommodate new elements or not? And what kind of elements can it accommodate? That actually speaks to its resilience more than whether it is or isn't invasive, right? And this for our social movements really matters. This is a different way of thinking about, for example, disability rights versus disability justice. Disability rights has been about or disability access more correctly, was sort of like thinking that disability is something that people have and we want to make accommodations. And disability justice is, that is just diversity that society has decided not to accept, which is a totally different mind frame, right? It's like disability is not a condition of a person. It is a relationship to what we say, what is diversity we will or will not include, accommodate, have latitude for, right? So there are ways of taking, like, and this really matters if we always think that non-native is invasive. What does that say to us about what we're cultivating in our imaginations about communities, about people, about migration, about, right? Because all of those are natural processes that we experience all the time. You know, I am definitely not taking out the pomegranate in my garden because it is non-native. I am keeping that pomegranate. And the pomegranate is not trying to take over my yard. Right? And that is because I wish the pomegranate was taking over my yard. But because things are finding their balance and being able to maintain a right relationship. Right? So latitude, elasticity, accommodation, these are different ways of talking about it. And, we try to use different words in different spaces based on what people need to do. So that's one really important aspect of resilience. How much change can you experience, assimilate, stretch to accommodate without it being disruptive of the core functioning identity of the group? So a second dimension, which almost seems exactly the opposite, which is why we think of them as a complex of things that work together, is resistance. Is the idea that something that you don't even experience it as a disturbance at all. Like, for example, the easy and obvious example for people to understand is your immune system, right? A child gets 40 colds a year. Every year under the age of 5. By the time, how many people have had to be around? I'm a preschool teacher in real life. So I spent a lot of time working with young children. And so they get 40 colds a year, every year under the age of 5, right? You'll never get the same cold twice. Because you build up an immunity, you build up a resistance to it. So then you're exposed to the same virus more than once. You just don't get it more than once. You get different ones, and you build up your immunity over time, right? And that's actually a form of resistance. That is to say, something that under one condition might actually be disruptive to your core functioning, or at least a disturbance in it that might actually a healthy disturbance, really, because once you get the cold, you never get it again. Is a kind of resistance, and you can even see in living systems, how when living systems they're all nested, right? Systems are nested in other systems. You can see how one system or one area can be a kind of resistance for another, right? Like the wetlands in the Gulf Coast, or wetlands in general, dissipate the impact of storms, which acts as a form of resistance for inland communities. So people, after Katrina and there's the disaster capitalism, an enormous amount of organizing was happening. Then 5 years later, we had BP, the Deepwater Horizon, and that year was also the U.S. Social Forum. And the folks from Gulf South Rising, Colette Pichon-Ballot, who also has been here, she went through the retreat, she's been here a couple times, went through the MG retreat here. When you would ask them what they want after, what their demands were post Deepwater Horizon, and so she's a African American Bayou girl, grew up in Louisiana, is also a lawyer. She's a lawyer for the United Homa Nation, which is an unrecognized tribe that is the wetland, that are from the wetlands, and they're unrecognized because their territory is the wetlands. So let's be clear, like they just don't happen to be an unrecognized tribe. If they had sovereignty over their wetlands, that would be a huge form of resistance for our movement against oil drilling. But the interesting thing is all of those communities got together and they needed compensation for the oil spills, for their livelihood loss, all these things. But what was their demand? Their demand was, we want our wetlands back. We want our wetlands back. And the reason is because what it takes to get those wetlands back means the restoration of indigenous sovereignty, means the end of the oil drilling, but it's a way of getting to the bigger story, because if they just said we want compensation for the oil spills, then that's one kind of demand. If we say we want our wetlands back, then we're saying we want a fundamental transformation of the entire economy, including reparations. That's what that says. So, but this idea of the wetlands themselves being the resistance and dissipating the impact of something that would otherwise be catastrophic, and the erosion of that resistance being the compromising of their resilience as communities inland, is a really good example of from an ecological front. So what are our strategies for resistance against the kinds of disruptive forces that we might see in our organizing? What are the kinds of changes that might be coming that we need to have latitude and the ability to accommodate or to? Then we get to the next couple. And you're watching my time, right?
Great, 13.
Oh, great. Okay, good. We're halfway through. So the next few are really focused on diversity. Diversity is our best defense. Like, if you were to reduce the resilience question down to the one-liner, which we probably got from somebody in this room, Brock or Kendall or Melissa or David, and of course, who got it from generations and generations of being on planet Earth. Diversity is our best defense. So then resilience comes down to one way we think about it is what are the different kinds of diversity that matter in a system or in living systems, and even if we're going to organize ourselves as living systems. And so there's a couple things that we think about. One is one really important one is redundancy of core ecological functions. Right? The redundancy is a huge part of resilience. And we all can see very concrete examples of that all around us every day. We decide that we're going to pollinate all our food crops with a single pollinator, a European honeybee, and then something that is a threat to that one species is a threat to a core ecological function that compromises the integrity of the whole system, right? The honeybees collapse and suddenly we have a crisis because it's not a resilient system. Because there's not genetic diversity. There's that, it's all monocropping, but also because there's this problem of very little redundancy. The living world recognizes that. That's why there are so many different pollinators and so many different ways that decomposition happens, and so many different ways that photosynthesis happens, like in terms of like strategies, right? And it's because core ecological functions require redundancy. Our social movements, the industrial mind frame, doesn't conflates redundancy with duplication. And no offense, but if you were to ask people in the social movement what's their single biggest frustration with foundations, it's like always constantly having to explain how you're the only one who does what you do, right? Like, people say this to movement generation all the time. Oh my God, nobody does what you do. And my response is always, that should scare you. That is a problem. If you think it's that important, then it should be done by lots of different folks in lots of different ways. Like, we cannot afford to have this idea that it's just like, oh, we're so special and it's just us that does it. If we think it's a core ecological function, this idea of pollinating ideas across different aspects of the social movement. We need more ways of doing that. And it doesn't mean that the solution to there not being enough of it is movement generation should just get bigger and bigger and bigger. Biggering and biggering and biggering, to quote the Lorax, which is my favorite. I teach an ecological systems thinking class, and the first thing I make them read is the Lorax. So if you haven't read it, you should read it, preferably touch it. But it's really important that we recognize and we ask ourselves, what are the core, what are essential functions, core ecological functions, and what are the different ways that those are happening? And how can we recognize and value that diversity and create enough niche and opportunity that all of that redundancy can happen, can be together. It's not, I always say about our social movement, none of us are taking up enough space to fight over turf. Like, we just aren't, and it's true in the funding world, and it's true in social movement organizing, it's true in all the different spaces that we're in. We're like, we have to let go of that scarcity, because scarcity is a precarious frame, not a resilient frame. So that's one really important part of diversity, is this idea of redundancy. The other one, which actually is one of the hardest ones, I think, for our social movements and our organizations. And actually, when I say social movements, I want to be clear that I'm not actually interested in us saying, oh, like, grassroots organizing is the social movement, and us radical thinkers are the social movement, but the foundation world is not the social movement. Like, I actually don't think that's helpful for us. I think everybody should see themselves as an organizer, and we're organizing in different domains. And then it's a question of what are we organizing around. And if you're organizing around, ecological justice and an ecological revolution, if you're prepared to conspire with the rest of the living world to deal with the scale and pace and implications of the problem, then we're all part of the same social movement. We're just playing different roles, necessary roles. Form, like how different groups and communities and elements in the system are organized, but those so there needs to be structural diversity, but that structural diversity also needs to be interacting across organizational forms. So it's not enough to say we need, like right now our social movement has a problem, which is we're almost all organized as 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Right? That is, we are all collectively structurally vulnerable to what might be, a ridiculous but obvious threat, ridiculous in the sense that it seems small, but obvious threat, which is the IRS, the federal government deciding that they're going to suddenly audit every single one of our 501c3s. And one thing that I know for sure about most social movement people is we're not really good at paperwork. So we are actually vulnerable. I realize I'm being slightly facetious, but I'm actually being very serious that if we try and think we're going to win by organizing everything one way, we are compromising our resilience as a social movement. We don't have other places for people to enter into. We don't have ways of, we're compromising our integrity. We're vulnerable to structural threats. And this is what happens in an economy in which everything is organized into 5 banks. There's not only a lack of diversity in terms of like quote unquote genetic diversity, like species diversity. There's only 5 big banks, but there's also a structural problem, which is they're all organized exactly the same way. So a bubble bursts and they all go down. And who fared well in terms of institutions? Which institutions actually weathered the financial crisis best? Does anybody know which kinds of financial institutions took the least hit?
Small
Co-ops. Yeah, credit unions, cooperative banks, and community banks. Those are the ones that survived. Because they were investing directly in people in communities, right? They were member organized, they were just very, very different organizational form, and they provided a kind of resilience in the community setting for people who were engaged with them, versus the big banks who were all investing in exotic, derivatives of mortgage-backed securities. That's my time. Great. So thinking to ourselves, like, what are all the diverse ways that we should be organizing? How does our organizational form align with the roles that we play, and how do we interact across organizational forms so we don't say that, like, which happens a lot in our movements, where we say, and how do we innovate new forms? That, like, oh, these organizations get together, make this alliance, and this alliance goes and plays in Washington, D.C. and does this thing. How instead do we think, like, with much more creativity? So, like movement generation, OAEC as well, where we have a nonprofit piece of it, but then we're also a collective, and we're organized differently. And then we have a political home, and we're trying to create all these different kinds of ways of interacting. And then the last thing I'll say is to, I mentioned this already, so I'll just close on it, but like, in some ways, I don't know if I want to say opposite, but the flip side of resilience is precarity, right? The closer you are to losing your identity, the more vulnerable you are to even something that might have been not a big deal before, like a change or a disturbance that might have been something you could have absorbed, might be the thing that just pushes you over the edge, the less and less resilient you are. So the more precarious you are, and even the more precarious you feel, the less resilient you are in the face of change. And I think that's where how all of these other things working together gives us that sense of abundance, that sense of interconnectivity, that sense of expansiveness and latitude that allows us to not feel and in fact be precarious all the time as a social movement. And so as you all are thinking about, this might be, this might be a useful thing that you could use to think about how you're organizing yourselves as a group as a community of people. What's your identity, and how are you going to ensure that those kinds of things? I don't know if that's helpful.